Hey coders, and welcome back to another Vue.js tutorial where I'm going to show you how to build a Markdown previewer app. So just to kind of show you what we're building, on the left here we have a text area where we can type our Markdown. And if you're not familiar with Markdown, basically it's a hypertext language where it compiles down to HTML. And in Markdown, you can do a bunch of different stuff such as create titles. So this is going to make an H3 title. If I do one of them, it's going to make an H1 title. And on the right, this is kind of the HTML that the Markdown is going to be rendered into after it compiles. So just to show some of them, we can do, course titles. We can do bullet points. So I'll say 1, 2, 3. We can do this random paragraph text. Just copy and paste that a bunch. Of course, we could do unordered lists here. So 1, 2, 3. To demonstrate links, we could do something like this. So I'll say google.com, and that's going to be a hyperlink to google.com. In fact, I think I mixed that up. There we go. That's the correct way to do it. So you can do links, you can do images by simply doing something like this. And notice that we don't have an image here. So let me just go to like Google Images and say view image. Go to images, and I'm going to go here and just copy this image URL. So copy image address, and then instead I'm going to paste this view. So that's just kind of showing off like what we're building. We're not going to use any external Markdown packages that exist, or else this tutorial would probably be like 5 minutes. We're going to try to create our own Markdown directive, and we're going to use regex to kind of parse this text and re-render HTML on the right over here. So this is a good tutorial to kind of practice writing directives, practice writing Vue components that interact with each other, etc. So let's get started building out this previewer. I went ahead and just created a new project using Vue CLI version 3. And using the generated code, let's just go ahead and alter some stuff to make this work. So inside app.vue, I'm going to just remove our hello world stuff, and we can just go ahead and get started. One thing I will note that I already did is inside our index.html, I went ahead and just brought in a Google Web font and a bootstrap.css file so that we can use the CSS grid to kind of lay out our application. So nothing too crazy going on in here. And then also, what I'm going to do before we start going too much further is inside our assets folder, I'm going to add a style.css file. And I'm going to import that in our main.js file. So I'm going to say import.assets style.css. Just so that we can kind of declare some top level assets if we need them. So with that being said, let's start by going into app.vue. And in order to achieve what we saw with what we're going to build, we need to kind of start laying out some styles. So the first thing I'm going to lay out is I'm going to say class is equal to container, which is a bootstrap class. And that basically will just make sure that everything is wrapped and kind of centered on the page. And once we have a container class lined out, we can then do class of row. And inside your rows, that's where you can declare your columns. So on the first row, we're just going to make this a class of column. So make sure it takes up all the 12 grid locations. And we're going to give this an H1 of Markdown preview. And if I save this, we should see Markdown preview pop up at the top. One thing we also have in Bootstrap is a text align. So I'm going to say text center just to make sure that is aligned in the center. Awesome. So that is our first row. For our second row, we want to split that into 2 columns. So I'll say call MD6. And inside this H tag, I'm going to say Markdown. And instead of H1, I'm going to do H4. And then we're going to have another column right next to that. So this is our left column. This is our right column. And this is going to say preview. And these are going to be text aligned to left. So these look pretty good. And of course, we can do a little bit of style changes to make this, have some margin at the top. Have some empty -4 for margin at the top. Nothing too crazy. But before we start diving into laying out the text area in the preview section, let's go back to that style.css and just give the page a little bit more aesthetically pleasing styles. So one I'm going to just copy and paste in is a linear gradient for the background. And that is basically going to make it look a little bit nicer for background. I don't know if that's I'm not a UX expert, but it looks pretty nice, I guess. And I'm just going to go ahead and just give like a hard-coded height to this, just so that it doesn't keep repeating. And inside the body, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to include that font family called Libri Franklin, which is granted from that Google Web font that we brought in, just to make the font look a little bit nicer. All right. And then secondly, inside the style, I'm just going to add a light class, which is just going to be used for making the text white, and maybe also adding some drop shadow to that text. So basically, light class is going to have a text shadow, and it's going to be white. So in here, I could just go to all my H1s and just give it a class of light and make those look a little bit nicer. Cool. So the first thing we want to do is, if you remember in that example I showed, on this left column, we had a text area. So let's just go ahead and add a text area here so that the user can type in their markdown. And inside that text area, let's just go ahead and declare class info so that we can style it. So down at the bottom here, I'm going to say, just remove all this stuff because we don't need it. I'm going to scope this, and I'm going to do class info and just give it a height of 400 pixels and a width of 100% for now. So now we have a text area, which again, both of those styles are showing up. And then let's just go ahead and add a little bit of opacity to the background, just so it's not so bright of a white. For the text area, I don't want it to be resizable, so resize is none, and that'll get rid of that little resize icon at the bottom. And then additionally, let's give it a orange border. Maybe give it like 2 pixels for that or something. Outline of none, just so that when we click on it, it's not outlined. And I think that should be okay for the text area. So on the right column, what we want to do is declare a div, which we're going to pretty much be putting our markdown in. So I'm going to say div. That's also going to be a class info. And I'll just end that div right there and save this. And we should get a nice looking preview area now. And basically what we want to do here is inside of this div, let's just render out Markdown. And again, we haven't defined this yet. So let's go to our actual component script area, and we're going to say data. That's going to return a object that has a Markdown property. And I'll save that. And basically it's just going to render out whatever Markdown is. The next step is we want to kind of bind the text area to this Markdown data property. So what we can do is inside the text area, a directive you can use in Vue is called vModel, and I'm just going to pass it Markdown. So now basically whatever I type into Markdown, it's going to be rendered on the right side. So if I type in like hello world, stuff like that. Okay, so we're making some good progress, little baby steps. Now at this point, we haven't really touched our Markdown directives, but that's what we're going to be doing now. So if we go back to our main.js, let's go ahead and just pretend that we have a directive already declared. So I'm going to say import Markdown from @/directive/markdown. So we assume that there's a file called Markdown there. And we want to define that inside of our Vue app as a directive called Markdown. And just go ahead and pass down that Markdown object. And save that. This should crash because we haven't created it yet. And basically what this is doing is we're just telling Vue, if you see the keyword be Markdown anywhere, just go ahead and use this Markdown object that we're going to declare. So going back to our code, let's make that folder called directives, and let's make that file called markdown.js. And then in here, inside this markdown.js file, I can just do export default and object. Save that. And now at this point, we are still working. And kind of the last piece of that puzzle is now that we have the ability to use that markdown directive, let's use the directive. So very similar to this V model, which is a directive that's built in the Vue, we just made a custom directive, which we can declare just by putting V Markdown. So now this div, the V Markdown directive is going to be applied to. Cool. So for those who don't really understand what directives are, basically, again, you bind them to your DOM elements and they're going to run some code when stuff happens. So one of the hooks that a directive provides us is the bind hook. So inside here, basically, when the directive is bound to the V node / the DOM element, it's going to run. And this is basically only going to run once when the component is kind of like mounted. So if you notice here, it printed out this info div. Now that we have this element, we can do things to the text of the element to kind of modify it. And just to kind of further demonstrate that, let's go back to our app.vue, and I'm going to add some Markdown text. So hello world with a new line character at the end. And if I save that, now notice here it's printing out hello world inside of this element. More specifically, if I want to do text content or something like that, it's going to print out that text content of hello world. Cool. So what are we doing, or how are we planning to parse this Markdown language and print out HTML? One way we can do it, and again, I don't know if this is the best way, is we can just use regex. So basically, we declare some rules, we declare what we need to replace those strings that we find with, and then we run it once over our element. So to kind of show you a very basic example, let's try to process this one with the 4 hash symbols. In fact, I'll just make it 6 hash symbols for now. So make it 6 and save that. So inside of our bind component, what we want to do is we want to get the current text, so l.textContent, and we want to build up some HTML. So HTML is a variable equal to an empty string for now, and we want to kind of replace the text with some regex expressions. So I'm going to say HTML is equal to text.replace, give it a regex expression, and then also give it some string. And then I'll explain this in just 1 second. And then after we have this HTML where we've replaced our regex with DOM elements, we can just say l.inner HTML is equal to HTML. In fact, let's just do let HTML here, and we just get rid of that middleman. Okay. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with regex, let's just go ahead and move on to this regex tester online thing where we can play around with it to kind of understand what we're doing. So if we have some test string that looks like this, in fact, I have too many hash symbols in it, so let me go back and remove that. Cool. We have some test string that looks like this. How do we grab any string that starts with 6 hash symbols and then replace it with something else? Well, first of all, we need to write regex, which is going to find 6 hash symbols. And then that regex expression is going to be followed by an optional space. And then what we want to do is grab and group everything that's after that. That pretty much we can use a character class here and say everything that's not a new line, and then group that so we can grab it, and then followed by a new line. And that is going to be our regex. So again, notice here we have 6 hashes, a space. We have any character that's not the new line, 1 or more, which is this. We're grouping it so that we can actually extract it in our replace method. And then finally, we end with a new line. So if I were to take this and just plop it down into our regex here and save it, going back to our previewer, notice that this is now replaced. So that was kind of to demonstrate we found the correct regex here and we replaced it. But we want to take that group and wrap it in an H6, right? So instead we can do H6 And then inside these DOM elements or this XML, we could just do $1 to grab the first grouping, which is here. So now when I save this, notice that hello world is printed out in an H6 tag. So if I were to inspect this, notice that H6 is here inside HTML, and we are currently processing our first Markdown rule. Cool. So now at this point, we will need to declare a bunch of different rules to be able to process all the different regex Markdown rules, right? So here I'm going to say const rules is equal to an array of arrays. And that first entry in the array is going to be our regex. So if I take this, boom, and our second entry is going to be what we're replacing it with. So take this and boom. Make sure I get rid of those extra things. And what we can do is just loop over all of our rules and do the same logic here on line 9. So I'm going to say rules.forEach, and rule template. This is just array deconstructing, and then I could just go ahead and basically run the same command, but instead of hard coding these, I'm going to say rule template. Cool. So if I save this, we should get the same outcome, but now we've abstracted our rules in such a way that we can simply just add some more. So if we were to go back and go ahead and try to add like a rule for just one hash symbol, notice that this regex is not being fixed because we haven't added a rule for it. So if I go here and just add one hash, this is going to be h1 with h1. Notice that that is going to be an h1 now. So before we type out all the different rules, which is just basically knowing how to do regex, and I'm probably not going to go over all these since some of them get a little bit complicated. One thing I'll notice is that as you type different stuff, it's not updating in the preview. And that is because this is only calling once when the directive binds and the DOM element is put into the page. So it's never actually going to re-render this stuff. So to kind of fix that, I don't know if this is a proper solution. I'm sure there's a way to make our directive a little bit more complicated to do this dynamically, such as like watching for it. In fact, this is maybe why you may want to use a prop instead. A component instead, but I'm not sure if you can access the DOM from a component. But anyway, what we can do is we want to just basically re-render this DOM element anytime Markdown changes, right? So one thing we could do is just bind key to this. And I think we could just give it Markdown. So basically, anytime Markdown changes, this is going to re-render our preview over here. So if I save this, now as I type different stuff, notice that it's re-rendering on the right. So at this point, we can just go ahead and copy and make those other rules. So H5432. Then over here, we can save 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Save this. And just verify that this is working. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A, B, C, D. Okay. Cool. So we have basically our previewer good to go. The last step is just going to be updating all these rules to support all the different Markdown. I don't know if I want to go through all the different rules because honestly it's just regex. So you may want to just take a tutorial on regex, but it's basically going to be the very similar logic. So I'll do maybe like one or two. So one regex you should be able to do is bold. So what we could do here is we're going to do find me a string which has stars. Let me just get rid of all this and try again. So find me a string that has some stars. And then inside the center of those, we want any text that is not a star. So /star. In fact, I think I need to escape the stars. And I need one or more. So I think this should work. If I save this and make sure I change this to a bold tag instead now. And of course, make sure you have the grouping there. So let me add that grouping. So if I were to type ** bold, boom, okay, bold's working now. And I could easily just do that with like italics, right? So I'll just go and do just a single slash is going to be italics. And save that file. So now we have bold, we have italics. Awesome. Another thing that'd be nice to have is we want to make sure every new line character wraps something in a paragraph. So if I just go back here and say wrap my content or my group in a paragraph, if it is sandwiched between a new line character. So I'm going to say, give me the parentheses, give me every character that is not a new line character, like so. And then give me one or more of those, and then also give me it has to end with a new line character. And let's see if this works as intended. Okay, so basically it's going to grab anything that ends with a new line, it's going to put on a new paragraph after it does all this stuff. I don't know if this is the proper way to do it. It's just one solution. So we could go through and basically do all the different styles. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste the remaining rules in, and we should just be able to kind of wrap up this tutorial because I don't want to spend too much time doing regex in this tutorial. So now at this point, we should have access to all those different, the Markdown that we saw before. So as an example, we can do the link. So now we have links, which is this one down here, line 20. Images, like we saw before. We could do lists, like we saw before. Awesome. So that basically wraps up our Markdown preview tutorial. Again, if you have a better suggestion as to how I could be making this directive, I know you can probably get super complicated using JavaScript and like changing DOM elements and whatnot. But I wanted to keep it kind of simple as I could, just using regex and the simple bind method. Again, like using this :key, maybe that's not the best approach to kind of re-rendering this. Be sure to subscribe, and also I'll put my Twitter link below, which is also where I kind of give out updates. And then the GitHub repo is also going to be in the description below. All right, thank you so much for watching.